sometimes we are a hot mess, and we can't let our embarrassment or shameful, feelings prevent us from being that hot mess before God, because it is in that place of utter vulnerability, that then God begins to remend and reattend to us in the way that we feel maybe unseen, unheard, unloved by God in those places.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Digital Examen podcast. I'm Jay, your host. And as always, I am so thrilled and grateful that you're joining us for this conversation. I want to start with a random bit of information about me. It is quite random, but it'll make sense why I'm sharing it here in a moment. I'm Korean American and grew up in a single parent household, just me and my mom. And my mom, when I was growing up in the kitchen, it was common that I would smell the sweet aroma of bone broth cooking. This is common practice in Korean cuisine, by the way, boiling bones for a really long time to make this really rich, earthy broth. And Korean people use it in Korean cooking for a wide variety of soups and stews and a number of other things. Anyways, can be quite delicious when done well. So this whole idea of like bone broth, even as I say the words, I could like smell it, I could smell the aromas. But it wasn't like an overtly spiritual practice for us. It was a way to survive, really. I mean, it was cheap to make and it could go a long ways. And as a single parent, my mom was always looking for ways to stretch every dollar, every penny, and making vats and vats of bone broth and a wide variety of different soups and stews with that was one of the ways to make ends meet, essentially, and still have food on the table. Now, all of that to say, something as simple and basic as bone broth can become such a beautiful thing. It can become a holy and sacred experience. In light of all of that, I want to read for you a prayer titled A Prayer for Making Broth. I'll read it for you. O Lord, you who spat upon the dirt in order to make mud that would heal a blind man's eyes, bless, I pray, these elements of earth, water and fire, root and leaf, fish and fowl, spirit and spice, so that by the powers that you have vested in nature and enlivened by your spirit, they might heal and restore all who drink it. I pray this in the name of the one who sends ravens to Elijah to deliver him bread and meat both night and day. Amen. That prayer, A Prayer for Making Broth, was a prayer written by David Taylor. And David Taylor wrote this prayer specifically for his wife, Phaedra Taylor, who has a regular habit of making broth in their home. And today on the podcast, I am speaking with both David and Phaedra Taylor about finding beauty and holiness and the sacredness in ordinary moments, and even discovering joy in the midst of pain, and how the art of the written word and the art of the visual arts and a variety of other expressions can help get us there. David Taylor is a theologian. He's a professor. He's an author and an Anglican priest. His written work usually focuses on the intersection of theology and the arts. And he lives in Austin, Texas with his wife, Phaedra, who is a visual artist whose paintings are a mix of watercolor and acoustic methods. And they emphasize ideas like play and memory and belonging. And together, the Taylors create these beautiful liturgical resources for people to encounter God in deep, meaningful ways through the arts. And I think you're going to get a lot out of this conversation. And so without further ado, here's my conversation with David and Phaedra Taylor. David, Phaedra, thank you both so much for joining us on the Digital Examen podcast today.
Awesome.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jay.
Yeah. David, I want to start with you. It's a beautiful book, Prayers for the Pilgrimage. You have this line. You say that the triune God attends to the details of our lives, that he's infinitely interested in those specific aspects of our lives where we find ourselves actually believing or disbelieving that God wishes to meet us in the pain and pleasure of life's circumstances. So I love that you name that, he's infinitely interested in those details. And sometimes we believe that, but honestly, my guess is, this is true for me, my guess is for many people listening and watching, most of the time we probably find ourselves disbelieving it. Maybe intellectually we might believe it, but like in our bodies, does God really care about these details? I want to ask you, and Phaedra, feel free to jump in here as well. Tell us a bit about how both of you arrived at this conclusion, maybe even experientially, because it's clear through both of your work that you really believe this in your bodies, like, did you always sense the sort of imminence of God in all things, or did you sort of arrive here in any particular way?
I think maybe there are a couple of reasons or factors that come into play that have shaped how I think about this thing that I said in the book. One is I was raised in the Bible church tradition, and some people know what that is, other people don't. So I essentially define the Bible church as Baptists who love expository preaching. And it was wonderful in many, many, many ways. It was a gift to me on so many counts in my spiritual life, but I don't think we had an active sense that God is here and now moving and at work transforming our lives in present tense ways. And it wasn't until late 90s, I was teaching a little January intensive at a charismatic church up in Waco, Texas. And I came to the classroom one morning feeling unwell. And a young person came up and asked me how I was doing. I said I was not doing well. And he asked if he could pray for me. And as a Bible church person, in my mind, that translated as at some point in the indefinite future, I will pray for you. And he said, no, can I pray for you right now? And it caught me by surprise, but it has functioned as a kind of like a before and after for me in my spiritual life, this sense that the Holy Spirit really wants to be present and active in the moment, in real time. And then I think the second thing that shaped me was I was in seminary at the time at Regent College, and Eugene Peterson was one of the professors there. And if you've read any of his work, you know how much he cares about that idea that God is attentive to the details of our lives. And he introduced me and others in his classroom to Frederick Buechner's work. And he himself is rather well known for playing that idea in his memoirs, in his novels, this idea that our job is to listen to our lives. And if we listen, pay attention carefully enough, we'll discover this fathomless mystery at work in the details. And so it's not something I was raised with, that kind of disposition or that habit. It was something that was offered to me. And I think I've tried to live in light of, these things that I now believe to be true theologically, in my spiritual life. And it doesn't always come easily because I tend to be a future-oriented personality type, not present-oriented, but my wife is much more gifted at being present to the present. And so one of the prayers that I actually have in the book is a prayer for being present to the present, which was mainly a prayer that I wrote for myself and hoping that it might be helpful to other people. So I think that, that is what maybe informs that statement in the book for me.
Yeah. Phaedra, I'd love to hear kind of your journey too.
Yeah, it's interesting that maybe around the sort of same age, we were having a clarity of this. And maybe that's just a natural maturing in your thinking and your relating to the world. But I came to Christ when I was in my early 20s. And I think when I first started living a full life of faith, my expectation is that I would be safe now that I knew the living God in a new way, in a greater way. And that was not anybody's fault. That was just an assumption that I had. And then through living life, I kept not being safe. I kept having these experiences where I felt very unsafe. And things that were struggles and things that were hard that happened, and it just kept surprising me. And I think those things slowly taught me that it wasn't that God is safe in a way, but this world is not safe. And it isn't that God magically steps in and makes our lives as his followers easier and safer. It's that in the things that are inevitably awful and painful, that we're not alone, that he is present, and that he gives attention to the way that we are feeling and experiencing those things. That is the core of what it means for him to be with us. And I couldn't have learned that without experiencing it. I think coming to know God was for me, such a huge transformational life moment that I just thought, well, this is it. I have everything I need now. And it took some time for me to figure out that the longing that I had post coming to know Jesus wasn't because I was doing something wrong or because I misunderstood something major about myself or the world. It was just because I was forced to have to reconsider how God was interacting with my life. And so then it became more of like I mentioned, I'm not alone in the pain, or the presence is what he is offering, even if I'm going through something that feels terrible. The gift, the grace, the healing, the comfort that he offers is that he's there with me and that he understands deeply what I'm experiencing. And so once you sort of get to this place where you're like, okay, God's presence is the powerful thing that I get to experience, that he invites us into, then it's easier to translate into, well, where is he everywhere then? Where is his presence displayed in everything, not just in the hard things?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of circles back to the end of that line that I read, David, that you've written, that God meets us. He wants to meet us, not just in the pleasure, but in the pain of life circumstances, which then I could sort of infer that probably means he wants to meet me in everything in between those two extreme points, the pain, the pleasure, then all of the different, the long scale of the ordinary, mundane. It's not pain or pleasure. It's just life sort of thing. Phaedra, as I'm listening to you talk about your story, first of all, it's like really stunningly beautiful. It strikes me that the thought I have as I'm listening to you talk about your journey, I can relate to the journey because I think I had to go on the journey of moving from thinking about God as an idea to experiencing God by his spirit as a person. And people are active and alive and they're dynamic. They're not like a static set of, they're not hammers in my toolbox that I use to fix a problem. They're people. They're alive and they have feelings and emotions and intention and will. And that's actually what makes us feel, a hammer, any tool cannot help me feel with someone. It's just a tool that I leverage and use as needed. But really, ultimately, as a human, what I need is like a person, like an actual active living being. And I think that shift in imagination is so important. So I wanted to ask both of you, just shifting to imagination. I think your writing, David, and your art, Phaedra, helped do this, for me at least on a personal level, sort of expand my imagination. And this is a big question, but like, what role do you think imagination plays in helping us perceive like these ordinary details of our lives as really sacred ground? And if anything, like just as a cultural diagnosis, are there things in the modern age you think that are sort of like inhibiting our imagination, our ability to see, holiness and the sacred amid the ordinary, in the pain and the pleasure? And I know that's a big question, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think this is a lot of what you're talking about in this season of the digital examine, is like slowness, attending, noticing. I That to me seems like the biggest thing really is you can't, for me, I can't imagine something deeply or even get into the brain and heart space where I have access to that if I'm rushing or if I'm distracted or if I'm worried about all of the things to accomplish, which there are so many in this modern life. And so for me, the slowing down has been the key to being able to switch into a space where I could imagine something. And I think that's such a challenge because your environment impacts that. And so there are people for whom that's going to be so much harder because their environment just doesn't allow for a lot of slowness or quiet. It seems easy to just say slow down, but depending on what kind of life you live, you may not be able to do that in very many significant ways. So I think there is a way that we need community and each other in order to help the slowing down happen. And I think that's why it's powerful to talk about it, like you're doing here, or talk about it with our communities, our church communities. Like, this is something that is essential to understanding and interacting with God in a way that's not a tool, like you mentioned. I think that's sort of like it's the field work, or like the laying the foundation for imagination to happen. Some things have to come first, I think.
Yeah, I piggyback on that maybe by saying that when we're able to slow down, maybe what opens up is the capacity to pay attention. And then what are we attending to? And how does the imagination enable us to see things that we could not see otherwise? And just to state the obvious, in the Gospels, all of Jesus's listeners are experiencing empirical reality as a rather brutal one because of the empire, 400 years of silence from the prophets. And so life reality as they experience it empirically is pretty dire, and they have certain ideas about God, certain ideas about the Messiah, certain ideas about the present and the future. And so then Jesus deploys the imagination in order to continually say, what if? What if God is like this and not like that? What if the work of his kingdom is like this and not like that? And I think for all of us, no matter what time or place we find ourselves in, empirical reality can feel oppressive. It can feel brutalizing because it is, in a sense, totalizing. It basically says your life will always be hard. There will never be relief. You will always be lonely. The world will always be violent. The powerful will always get away with what they think they can get away with. Like for myself, when I was a child, I thought I would be married and have children by the age of 25. I didn't marry until I was 35 and didn't have my first child to almost 40. And what I really struggled with was not knowing what my story was. Like, I couldn't figure out what story I was inside of, because the story I experienced firsthand was a very deeply discouraging one. And I felt like I was always going to be late and slow, and the fullness of family life that I had imagined for myself was not on empirical offer anywhere around me. And so I needed somebody, and really in this sense, for both Phaedra and myself, artists have helped us to reimagine. Like, I re-see myself in a story, a novel, a movie, a poem, a painting, to be able to re-see who I am, to reimagine my life is actually okay. I'm not alone. It's not always going to be hard. It's not always going to be one of regret or bitterness. And so plenty of novelists, plenty of filmmakers, artists of all kinds have this unique capacity to help us to reimagine. And I'll just end by saying, on the cover of one of my books, Glimpse of the New Creation, is a painting that I commissioned from an artist here in Austin, and it hung on the back wall of our sanctuary in the church where I was a pastor. And it's this 9-foot tall, 20-foot across wide painting of the resurrected Christ, and below his feet is the harrowing of hell, and above is sort of the New Jerusalem coming, and then all around him is this swirling dynamic color, and it has not just so-called religious spiritual imagery, it has very mundane, ordinary type imagery as a way to say that Christ, even now by his Spirit, is making all things new. And I purposely wanted that to be on the back wall. So it was the last thing people saw as they went out into their week. So it would impress itself on them and help them reimagine when they're changing diapers at 2 a.m. for the umpteenth time, and they feel so miserable. And so like, there is no hope around the corner. I'm going to be doing this in perpetuity, or a marriage is failing, or a child is leaving the faith. Do you have this image that helps you reimagine how grace intersects and interrupts and abides with us in the most unexpected ways? So for me, very much has been artists, and I'm very grateful, lucky that I get to be married to one. So it's a wonderful gift to me.
I had one more thought to sort of tie maybe what I was saying and what David is saying is, like you said, this is one reason why we feel so passionate about artists and supporting artists and helping artists be in church communities and helping churches embrace the unique role of artists in their communities, is because not everyone has the sort of life situation that allows them to fully explore, embrace their imagination in the way that might come easier to artists of all kinds, writers, poets, dancers, musicians, and so I think that is an offering that people that are able to access that easier or more quickly give to others.
Yeah, my introduction into your work, Phaedra, was by way of David's books and your contributions to them visually. And what you just said sort of puts words to what I feel when I look at your work, in the sense that, one, it's hard to explain in words. That's why art is so profoundly beautiful in some ways. But if I had to put words to it, when I look at your art, it does feel like a gift. It feels very personal, like a gift from the artist, from you to me as the viewer, who does not have the skills, in my hands and in my body to be able to create the work. But when I see the work, there is a connection to the work. It's like, oh man, this work expresses quite a bit of what I feel, in ways that words alone can't really capture. I sense a sort of, a grounded sense of grace. There's a real profound sense of peace in so much of your work. I love what you said, David, about the art piece that you would commission, the sort of in between New Jerusalem and hell and the world that is to come, in the in between, and the vision of, wrong things being made right. I have that same sense when I look at your work, Phaedra. There's this sort of like wrong things being made right. So on a personal level, I'd love our people to hear just a little bit about your journey into art. How did you get there, and where maybe some of that sort of art as a gift and the sense of grace and peace comes from. And, I sense when I look at your art, it's like a form of visual prayer. And I don't know if you feel that way about it, but I'd just love to hear you talk about it. How do you see your work as you offer it to the world?
I very much relate to it as prayer. And I have for most of the time that I've been making art. When I started making work, I was not yet a believer. And so, those first few years, I was sort of grappling with like, what does it mean to be an artist? I didn't come to art until I was in college. So I was always like a very imaginative person and a very deep thinker. And I grew up in Scotland, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world. So I had, rich beauty experiences. And I feel like my family did a good job of doing things like taking me to museums, and we listened to classical music, and we were outside a lot. So, all of that was fertile, rich sort of fodder for me to be a creative type person. But I didn't really come to art until school. And I was never somebody that like drew a lot, or, I wasn't that kid that was like, oh, I always want to take art. I always want to be doing art. So it was sort of a surprise to me and actually everybody in my family. And I learned how to draw. Thankfully, I had a really wonderful professor for my first 2 drawing classes that approached it as like, this is a skill in the same way that you take lessons to play piano or any instrument. You can take lessons to draw. It's a skill that you can learn. And so just because you maybe don't know how to do it at the beginning doesn't mean that you're not able to do it. And that was really powerful to me because I think up until then, I'd sort of thought like, you're either an artist or you're not. It's like a magical sort of like you have it or you don't. And so the fact that if you want to, you could learn technically how to do some things was transformational. So then, I started studying art and then ended up getting my degree in sculpture. Um, and so I think the first few years was very technical for me. And then I, became a person of faith. And then it was like, well, what am I doing with this now? How do I relate to this thing that I've been giving myself to? And do I have to give it up or do I have to transform it in some way? And so I think then there were a few years of me trying to figure out how to integrate my faith with my artistic work, and prayer emerged as the way to do that, I think, because I was thinking about, well, what am I doing with this? And what I really wanted to do was celebrate things that filled me with wonder, to draw attention to them so that other people could experience that as well, and to be in a space with God where I was bringing my deepest, hardest, most painful longings to him and then doing something with it. And that doing something ended up being making art, and not just making art about this thing that is painful or this longing that I have, but making art about where are you in this, and making visual the hope and the grace that I needed and that I was receiving sort of as I was making it. So not just the absence, but also the way that Jesus is present to us in that. Both those things together was sort of, when I came to that idea, that was like, oh, this is what I want to do with my art. And that's sort of where I've stayed. I haven't wanted to move beyond that because I feel like I could just do that forever. Because there's so much in being human, and then there's so much in learning the way that Jesus is with us in that, you know.
Thank you for sharing the story. It reminds me, David, you write, you have so many beautiful, punchy lines like this, but you write that all aspects of our lives must be prayed, lest we become atheists in the quotidian parts of our lives, because we've come to believe that these parts are in fact godless or devoid of God's interest and care. And it makes me think quite a bit about what Phaedra just said and her story of discovering this gift that needs to be prayed, essentially, that art is a form of prayer. And I think for a lot of our listeners and viewers, that's a beautiful line. All aspects of our lives must be prayed. But for those of us who aren't, pastors or priests or academics or artists, visual artists, what does that mean? How might we begin to think about changing diapers and writing code at the tech company where we're just barely, how do we think about all aspects of our lives as being realities that we pray? What does that look like?
I have a couple thoughts, but then I wonder, Phaedra, if you would be willing to share what it is that informed your choice of using the little houses and the gold leaf in the paintings that show up in the book, because I feel like that is such an acute and accurate visual metaphor for describing some of this. So I'll say someone like Brother Lawrence, who is known to many, maybe listeners. He didn't write this book, but it was a recording, a transcribing of a conversation he had. It was titled Practice of the Presence of God. And what I find so helpful about that, the way that he describes his life as a continuous practice of the presence of God, which is a form of prayer, is that it avoids two extremes. One is the hyper spiritualizing of our lives, and the other is hypo spiritualizing of our lives. And on the one hand, we have, let's just say, the supernatural overwhelms and swallows up the natural. So that, let's say, the ordinary, mundane, normal parts of our lives have no integrity. It's just like we're always in this state of paralysis because every moment we're saying, oh, Holy Spirit, should I put my hands down? Should I type right now? Should I walk out the door? Should I get a drink of water? and I'm going to wait until I hear. Right? That's the one error on one side. On the other side, the hypo-spiritualizing is that the natural overwhelms and engulfs the supernatural. That is, there's no sense in which God is present and at large in our, ordinary circumstances. And so it's all up to me to figure it out. And then at some specific express religious spiritual moment, I do that stuff, right? And Brother Lawrence has this wonderful, you could call it mutual interactivity, that he's fully present and God is fully present. And there is this very lovely flowing back and forth between his sense of what he's doing, washing dishes and repairing sandals, which is what he did a lot of. And I had one retreat that I took that Richard Foster happened to be present at. And I felt like watching him and interacting with him, like he was like, the embodiment of Brother Lawrence, because he had this gentle, lovely, undramatic attunement to God's presence. And so it wasn't that every time we talked, he was asking, well, how can I pray? It was just sort of his God talk had this very, as it were, casual, natural way of intersecting. And so I have, prayers for the changing of the diapers in the middle of the night, prayers for the blessing of the little deeds, prayers for a grumpy mood, for, again, not settling in life, because I want to help myself and maybe others realize that in the very present tense of a grumpy mood, I could somehow figure out how to invite God into it without being overly dramatic about it. But I do feel like she has these two, I guess I would call them visual metaphors in the paintings that she's included in the book that I felt very powerful, and I hold them in my own imaginative, tank or toolkit or treasure trove box, because I can return to them continuously and wonder to myself, how might God be present to me by accessing these visual metaphors.
I want to give you a moment here to take a few deep breaths. If it's safe to do so, wherever you're listening or watching, maybe close your eyes for a few moments. And I want us to ponder and consider some of what David said about the human tendency to hyper-spiritualize or to hypo-spiritualize, meaning sometimes we allow the spiritual to overwhelm the natural. And other times, we allow the natural to overwhelm the spiritual. And just like David said about people like Brother Lawrence, who found this incredible sense of God's loving presence in the simplicity and the ordinary work of washing dishes or fixing sandals in the monastery. Or Richard Foster, who had this, I love the phrase, undramatic attunement to God's presence. Are there ways in which you might be missing the loving presence of God in the midst of the ordinary, either because you are over-spiritualizing everything, or because your tendency is to neglect the reality of the spiritual and the sacred all around you? One of the best ways to undramatically attune ourselves is to take deep breaths, to clear our minds. Maybe if you're familiar with the practice, centering prayer. So I want to give you a few moments. And even now, if you can, if you are able, spend just a few moments attuning yourself undramatically at peace to the loving presence of God that is all around you. And then we'll return to our conversation with David and Phaedra Taylor.
The two images that David is talking about are from the paintings that are in our book that we did together. And one is a small white house. So the paintings for people that haven't seen the book are mostly wild landscapes that are open with dramatic skies, and then these small houses that are kind of in the distance in some way. And then there are these lines that are coming from heaven to earth or earth to heaven that are intersecting these small gold lines. So David's talking about the white houses and then the lines. So maybe I'll just talk about what they are and then connect them to your question. But the houses for me emerged as this visual sort of way of understanding how Jesus is with us, but also can seem very far away. So as we're traveling through life, our sort of the journey, that's the landscape image is kind of this idea of we're journeying through life. It's a bit of a wilderness and we're walking along, but we don't always feel that Jesus really is right there. But these houses are sort of along the way, and they are points of hope that we can look to say, okay, right now on the path, I'm not feeling supported by the presence of God. I'm feeling like I'm just trudging, but I see that there is a house in the distance, and I know that in that house, Jesus is waiting for me. Of course, Jesus is always with us, but we just don't experience that fully all the time. And the houses came from this tradition in Scotland of having these small houses that are in the Highlands that are called bothies, and they are made for people that are hill walking and traveling across these big landscapes, and they are free moments of shelter. And there's this long tradition of people using them, and they're generally white. And so it's this idea that there is a free sheltering moment that is waiting for us. And our feeling like the wilderness is, really frightening, that if we can see that and know that Jesus is ahead, then we know that we're not going to have to be in this wilderness all the time, which are sort of the idea that God is always interacting with us in some way, always tethered in some way to his people. And sometimes it's a very thin, tiny line. And sometimes it's kind of a thick band of gold that lays over like a blanket or is a foundation under, all the different ways that God interacts with us and all the ways we feel his presence that are different. So the combination of those is answering the question of where are you, God, and what are you doing? And then when people are in their ordinary everyday, working at their job, answering emails, putting shoes on, those things might come to them and that might help them pray a little bit. And whereas David's prayers are word-based, my hope is that the paintings that I make become prayers that are image-based. So when you're putting on a toddler's shoes and you have no brain space to even think of a line of a prayer, but you can think of a little bit of gold in the way it interacted with a landscape, and that can be your prayer because God understands that prayer as well.
I definitely sense that when I look at your work. I mean, one of the things I love about art is hearing the artist's story, which you just so beautifully shared with us. And in the show notes, for those who are just listening, not watching, you can click the show notes and we'll point to all of Phaedra's work because it is visual, obviously. You've got to see it. And we would highly encourage that. It colors the piece so much. I had some assumptions and my own interpretations, but what a beautiful thing. It's one of the things I love about great art, whether it is visual art or even the art of words or any other form of art, music and otherwise, this sort of dynamism that it can wrap itself around. Just like you said, you want to offer it to us as a gift, not so that we look at it for a few moments and leave, but that it sort of, we carry it with us into the realities of our lives. And this idea, I love, the variance of the lines, that sometimes you feel so near and the relationship, the connection feels so rich. And sometimes it feels so fragile and thin, which is so true to just human experience and Christian experience. It reminds me, David, of this thing you write about prayer, that prayer really is about showing up with a commitment to be brutally honest with God about our doubts, our anger, our unanswered prayers, which is such an interesting thought, to pray angry maybe about prayers that have gone unanswered, and yet to still find yourself praying, honest about our failures, our fears, about what we might be ashamed to admit out loud. I just find that sort of invitation so liberating, so freeing, and so welcoming in terms of prayer. So I want, on the other side of that, my guess is that so many of us do not think of prayer that way. We think of it much more formulaically. But what do you think we miss out on, or lose when we sort of neglect or forget this expansive invitation to bring our whole selves, all of our pain, all of our pleasure, all of our doubts, in prayer?
I think on the one hand, it would reflect a false understanding of what it means to be human. And on the other side, it reflects a false understanding of God. I think when we're not honest to God about everything, all those things that we hide or withhold, they don't stay neutral in the dark. They can fester, become poisonous, cancerous. They can warp us. It does not stay neutral, all that scary stuff. But on the other side of the ledger, it's either to believe that God can't handle us, like he can handle a lot of stuff, but he cannot handle that part of our lives, and which is a very odd form of coddling God. And then it's also the sense that God is so serious and so otherly that we have to get our act together before we can say anything, and so we've mapped onto God certain ideas of royalty, if you will, or the emperor, but that is not the God that we encounter, in the face of our Lord Jesus Christ, who himself, offers all of his humanity up to the Father in gift, and so we are caught up within it, but also he models for us the kinds of prayers that we are given permission. And then, of course, the Psalms not only give permission, but they give us, a vocabulary that we can practice. We can inhabit that vocabulary. And Bonhoeffer talks about this. It's not our prayer lives, our instinctual or traditional prayer lives that inform how we read the Psalms. It's the Psalms ought to train us in a grammar of how we talk to God and how God can be addressed. And there's this wonderful line actually from Jeremiah. I don't know, is it Jeremiah 17? It's very psalmic because it starts off something like, oh Lord, you are righteous and just in all your ways. Of that I am sure. However, this I have to bring to your attention. And then it goes on and on about all the ways that this world is so messed up, and we along with it. And so, if we were to take Scripture even more seriously than we sometimes allege to take it, I think we would discover that, we can be, honest to God. And I have prayers, for being 100% honest to God, or one that some people don't like this title, but it's fine. It's for being a hot mess before God, because sometimes we are a hot mess and we can't let our embarrassment or shameful, feelings prevent us from being that hot mess before God, because it is in that place of utter vulnerability that then God begins to remend and reattend to us in the way that we feel maybe unseen, unheard, unloved by God in those places.
You also write, there's this prayer, beautiful prayer for the joyful life of Jesus, which the title alone is interesting to me because almost every work of art depicting the face of Jesus across Christian history, 98% of them depict him as sort of glum and somber and not all that full of joy on his face. It's just rare, to find pieces like that. And then Phaedra, when I think about your work, I think even listening to you talk about the process and even the pieces that you've described in great detail, it colors it in for me so much because it puts a finger on the pulse of what I feel when I look at much of your work, which is that there's real honesty here. This is not a sort of, what you were talking about earlier with Brother Lawrence, hyper or hypo spiritualizing. It's not all roses and beauty, and it's not all just glum, natural, materialistic matter, and it's all going nowhere. It's a beautiful dance, which feels very real. And in this prayer, David, for the joyful life of Jesus, you sort of put into words this dance that is possible for us. You write that the joyful life of Jesus can cause joy to burst into being out of the sorrows of my life, so that I may experience afresh this day the joyous resurrecting life of Jesus. So I wanted to ask both of you, through visual art and through the art of words, and just for all of us who aren't painters nor writers, just living our everyday lives, and like, what does this look like? And how do we lean into this really beautiful dance of the possibility of joy, the joyous resurrecting life of Jesus in the midst of, not on the other side of, but literally afresh on this day in the midst of the sorrow and the pain and the struggle and the boring. Just talk about that from maybe not even as writers and artists, but like just as a human being and as a follower of Jesus. What does that look like in your life?
Two things come to mind. One, David and I, we made this work for ourselves. We made this separately. We were not thinking of a book. We were not thinking of sharing it as a unit together. I made these pieces for myself because I needed them for me. David started writing prayers because he needed prayers for himself. And then after we had this
That was
idea.
during the pandemic.
During the pandemic, yeah. One thing that I thought is, reframing maybe the way that we think about our work, and if it's what it's worth and what it's for and what it should be doing. And sort of and then this kind of gets into my second thought, being vulnerable and humble with it. Like, work not so that you can get approval, but just work for the fact that it's inherently good what you're doing, or that you can find something inherently good for the world in it, and for yourself in it. So it's that idea. But I think the other is that it does take a sense of being vulnerable to allow yourself to find wonder and hope and beauty and delight in those seasons where it's really hard, or when we're in the middle of something that's sad and painful, and where we're feeling like we're suffering, because pain is not a place where you want to be open. I mean, you want to guard yourself and defend against yourself. And so I think whatever small grace you feel, to be able to be vulnerable and to say, okay, this thing that's happening in my life is really painful, but right now I'm having this moment. This is going to sound so idealized, but I'm having this moment with this gorgeous apple that is beautiful and delicious, and like somehow being able to be like, okay, maybe God's grace for me in this moment is this delicious apple. And instead of pushing it away or saying that's silly, there's nothing wrong, I don't think, in taking advantage of all that God has made in this world and made in humans to find wonder and delight in the smallest little moments. I don't think there's anything silly about that. I think it's incredibly brave and takes a huge amount of strength and courage to do that. And so I think that would be maybe my encouragement. I feel like that's what it is to me, is like refusing to turn away from whatever small grace is presented to me, whether it's in the form of an apple or something that feels bigger and more smart or more sophisticated. But just being willing to be vulnerable, to say, maybe this is God's offering to me, and I'm going to take it seriously, even if it feels maybe like I'm making it up in some way. And I think God honors that desire, that childlike desire to find him in whatever way he is present. I have experienced that in my life.
So beautiful. David, I'd love your thoughts.
I think a couple of things have been helpful to me. Maybe you could say they have haunted me in a really good way. in what I have learned about joy. I wrote a book on the Psalms, so my headspace for quite a while was wondering what that was on about, all that joy language. But one thing that haunts me is this fact that Jesus chooses to attend dinner parties, which, we're all familiar with that. You have probably preached sermons on that. That's not what haunts me. What haunts me is that he spends, let's just say, multiple hours at a dinner party while Rome, at the same very moment, continues to abuse and use its citizens. The sick continue to be sick. The oppressed continue to be oppressed. The dead continue to stay dead. And Jesus chooses to not do anything about it. Right? That's the thing that I think is a theological pickle. Because you would think to yourself, God cares about redemption. God cares about salvation. God cares about all these things. So why didn't Jesus spend 24/7 doing everything he could to thwart the Roman Empire, to heal the sick, to deliver the oppressed, to raise the dead? And yet he wastes his time at a dinner party. So there's something there for us to pay very serious attention to, not to be deadly serious about, but to seriously pay attention to. And I think it brings into question our ideas of waste, and like wasting time, wasting energy, wasting money, wasting our, what it is that we do with ourselves and with others, and how a dinner party, I think, rightly understood in those times, would involve an awful lot of laughter and an awful lot of drink and an awful lot of good food. And we know he does that, and we know that he probably did that many more times than are recorded in the Gospels. So what does that say to us when the world is on fire here in so many different ways? Is it worth the while to have dinner parties? I think the answer is unequivocally yes, right? Because there is something deeply and profoundly and truly spiritual about that discipline, about the practice of joy, if you will. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and I'll just end with this, that I think it's important to keep very clear the distinction between happiness and joy. Happiness is a pure emotion, and it's a 1 or a 0. I'm happy or I'm unhappy. It's not a bad thing. It's okay to be happy. It's legitimate to be unhappy. But joy is very different, because joy makes space for a whole host of other emotions. So joy can exist in proximity with sadness and even with anger. And I think the other thing that we discover about joy, at least in the Psalms, is that joy is an emotion plus the will. So it's emotion plus will. So it's a feeling plus a choice. And so what does it mean for us to choose, not in a burdensome way, not in the way that somebody's coercing us, but to choose to attend, to open our eyes and ears and hearts to perceive how joy might coexist with the things that are hard and tedious and boring and frustrating and oppressive, and the whole gamut of human life, to perceive how God might be sneaking in little moments of joy, or might offer us joy were we to receive the gift of joy. So with eyes to see, ears to hear, a heart disposed, and a will that chooses to discipline itself, to choose it, I think we can discover how joy can be discovered in that perfect apple, if we choose to see that it is pure gift. It doesn't have to exist. God wills, not because anybody makes God make the apple, because out of joy, out of utter, inexpressible joy, he makes that thing exist. And so I think it is something that we can cultivate. And as we cultivate, a disposition of joy or a practice of joy, we are more naturally, if you will, able to perceive it and to welcome it and to preserve it over against all the ways. And then Chesterton talks about that Satan's greatest qualities is that he is pure joylessness, and that the serious business of heaven is joy. I love how that reframes what it means to be spiritual, what it means to be religious, what it means to be biblical, what it means to be Christ-like, that joy has this rich symphonic quality to it. It is not only one thing, it is many things, and it shows up in many ways. were we to have the eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart that is disposed towards it. So those are the things that I have noted. I'm not always good at it, but I am grateful that I see Jesus continually choosing to have that dinner party, even while Rome continues to crush and oppress. And somehow it is the most logical thing for Jesus to do in the kingdom of God.
Wow. Thank you both so much for that. Phaedra, you were commenting, I don't know if I'm making sense. It was riveting and sort of a gut punch to me as a preacher and as a writer who is always tempted to make things so that they get out there to other people. And you're right. There is a real miss in terms of what the work can and ought to do in me, and I see that obviously, David, in your work, the prayers, it's pretty obvious reading them. Oh, this is coming from just the real ache and the joy of a person who's in it and going through it, like all of us are. And there is that reminder that we're not alone. And it's just like, man, I'm going to be sitting with that for a long time, to think about Jesus wining and dining while Rome burns, and while there is so much to do. And it's not just wining and dining. It's all those moments that he lets himself be interrupted. It's when a little 12-year-old girl is dying and dead, and a woman who's already healed, she already got what she needed, is walking away, and he stops and he's like, who touched me? And the feeling is, why? She's good. You need to go. And yet he does not. And what an incredible gift. Thank you both so much for this conversation. For those who are listening and watching, if you're not familiar with David's work and Phaedra's work, I would honestly, just as a human being, I would highly recommend go check it out. Everything will be in the show notes. David, Phaedra, thank you both.
Thank you
for who you are, for what you do, and the incredible gifts that you're offering to all of us. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you guys so much for joining us for another episode of the Digital Examen. As always, if this podcast and these conversations are helpful to you, it's a huge help to us if you would rate and review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and share it with friends if you think it would be helpful to them. I want to leave you with this final word of blessing, as we always do on the Digital Examen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in this still moment, we pause to rest and relax into your presence. We thank you for the gift of this day, for the moments of light and levity and all of your many graces, big and small. Help us to notice the goodness you weave in and through all things. Help us to reflect honestly on our missteps, to bring them to you humbly. We trust in your mercy, which is always healing, always restoring. Remind us of your nearness and our joy, our sorrow, and all our in-betweens. And as we look to tomorrow, grant us the courage to surrender our plans to your care. Fill us with the trust that is grounded in your goodness, and open our hearts wide to your love, that we may carry your grace into the world. Amen.